Elena Voss stood at the tall window of the pack house, watching the fog roll over the training grounds, and she already knew something was wrong. It was 3 in the morning, and Damien's side of the bed was cold. This was not the first night. It was the 6th night this month, and every time she asked him where he had been, his answer came a second too late, wrapped in a smile that did not reach his eyes. She was the Luna of the Blackthorn pack, mate to Alpha King Damien Ashford, and for 3 years she had carried that title like armor. The pack looked at her and saw strength. They saw a woman who had helped rebuild the northern border after the war with the Ridgeback pack, who had negotiated peace with 2 rival packs without spilling a drop of blood, who stood beside her king in every council meeting with her spine straight and her voice steady. But armor does not stop a wound that comes from the inside. She turned from the window and looked at the empty bed. The sheets on his side were barely wrinkled, as if he had lain there for a moment out of habit before leaving again. She pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders and walked down the corridor, past the portraits of former Alphas and Lunas who had ruled this land for generations, their painted eyes seeming to follow her in the dim light. She told herself she was not checking on him. She told herself she trusted him, but her feet carried her toward his study anyway, because trust does not stop your body from seeking the truth your mind refuses to admit. The study door was open a crack, and the room inside was empty. Papers were scattered across his desk, and a candle had burned down to almost nothing, its wax pooling onto an old wooden tray. She stepped inside, drawn by something she could not name, and her eyes fell on a folded letter tucked beneath a stack of pack ledgers. She should not have touched it. She knew that even as her fingers reached for it, but 3 years of quiet doubt had worn down the part of her that once believed asking was enough. The letter was written in a hand she did not recognize, elegant and careful, the kind of handwriting that came from someone raised in a house with tutors and manners. It was not addressed to her. It began with words that made her stomach turn to stone. My dearest protector, I do not know how I survived before you came back into my life. She did not need to read further to understand what she was holding. She folded it back exactly as she had found it, her hands trembling, and placed it under the ledgers again, as though hiding the evidence might undo what she now knew. She walked back to her room in a daze, her mind racing through every excuse Damien had given her over the past 2 months. The extra patrols, the private meetings with the Council of Elders, the nights spent, he said, dealing with matters too delicate to share even with his own mate. She had accepted all of it, because that was what a good Luna did. She trusted her Alpha. She trusted the bond they shared, the one that was supposed to be unbreakable, forged not just by love, but by the ancient magic that tied their souls together the night they first met. But bonds could be strained. She had heard the elders speak of it once, in hushed voices during a council meeting she was not meant to overhear. A mate bond could weaken if one partner turned their heart elsewhere, if loyalty bent toward someone who was never meant to hold it. She had dismissed the idea then as an old superstition, something whispered by elders who feared change more than they understood love. Now she wondered if she had been wrong to dismiss it. By the time morning came, she had convinced herself she was overreacting. The letter could have been misdirected, a mistake, a piece of pack business tangled up with something personal that had nothing to do with her marriage. She wanted so badly to believe that, because the alternative was too heavy to hold. She dressed for the day, put on the calm expression that had become second nature to her, and walked into the great hall where the pack gathered each morning for the reading of duties. Damien was already there, seated at the head of the long table, speaking quietly with Nathan Cole, his second in command, and closest friend since childhood. When Damien saw her enter, he smiled, and for a moment, it was the same smile that had made her fall in love with him 5 years ago, warm and easy, the kind of smile that made a room feel safer. She almost let herself forget the letter. You look tired, he said, standing to pull out her chair, the picture of a devoted mate. Did you not sleep well? I noticed you were not in bed, she said carefully, watching his face for any flicker of guilt. There was the smallest pause, so brief that anyone else might have missed it, but Elena had spent 3 years learning every shift in her mate's expression. There was trouble at the eastern border, he said. A scouting party reported unusual movement near the old Cole estate. I went to check it myself. I did not want to wake you. The Cole estate. The name landed in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. She had heard of it before, The abandoned property that once belonged to General Marcus Cole, the great warrior who had died in battle 2 years ago defending Blackthorn territory from an invasion that would have destroyed everything they had built. Marcus Cole was a legend among the pack, a man whose portrait now hung in the Hall of Honor, whose sacrifice was spoken of with reverence at every gathering. "Is everything all right there?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "Nothing serious," Damien said, sitting back down and returning to his conversation with Nathan, as though the matter were closed. Elena took her seat, forcing herself to eat breakfast, to nod along with the morning reports, to play the role she had played for years. But her mind kept circling back to the letter, to the name Cole, to the strange coincidence that felt less like coincidence with every passing minute. She excused herself early, claiming she needed to check on the pack's healing house, and instead found herself walking toward the pack archives, where records of every family and estate in Blackthorn territory were kept. The archive room was quiet, dust floating in the thin light that came through the high windows. She found the file on the Cole family easily enough, and there, pinned to the front of it, was a small portrait she had never seen before. It showed Marcus Cole standing beside his wife on their wedding day, and the woman beside him had dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that seemed to hold a quiet kind of sorrow, even in a moment meant for joy. Her name was written beneath the portrait in careful script: Serafina Cole. Elena stared at the name for a long time, feeling something cold settle into her chest. She did not know why the name struck her so deeply, only that instinct, the same instinct that had once warned her of danger long before her eyes could see it, was telling her that this woman was not simply a widow whose estate needed checking. She closed the file and left the archive room, her thoughts a storm she could not calm. That evening, she tried to speak with Damien again, choosing her words with care, wanting to give him every chance to be honest with her before she said anything about the letter or the portrait. They sat together in their private quarters, a fire crackling in the hearth, and for a moment it felt almost like the early days of their marriage, when he used to tell her everything, when there were no locked doors between them. "Damien," she said softly, "is there something you need to tell me?" He looked up from the papers he had been reading, and for just a heartbeat, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like fear. "What do you mean?" "You have been distant," she said, "for weeks now. I feel like there is a wall between us, and I do not know what put it there." He set down his papers and reached for her hand, and his touch was warm and familiar, the same hand that had held hers through countless pack ceremonies, through the loss of her own mother 2 years ago, through every hard season they had faced together. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice sounded genuine, sounded like the man she had married. "The weight of leading this pack has been heavy lately. There are threats from the southern packs, matters of honor I owe to fallen warriors, responsibilities that keep me away more than I would like. It has nothing to do with us." She wanted to believe him so badly that for a moment she almost let the questions die in her throat. But then she remembered the letter, "My dearest protector," and the way his eyes had shifted when she mentioned the Cole estate that morning, and something in her refused to let the matter rest. "Who is Serafina Cole?" she asked, watching him closely. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an hour. His hand tightened slightly around hers, not painfully, but enough that she noticed. "She is Marcus Cole's widow," he said finally. "She returned to the territory recently. Marcus saved my life once, years ago, during the border conflict with the Ridgeback Pack. I owe his memory a debt of honor, and part of that debt is making sure his widow is protected and cared for." It was, on its surface, a reasonable explanation. Blackthorn pack law held that debts of honor to fallen warriors extended to their families, and Damien was known throughout the territory for his devotion to tradition. But something in the way he said her name, Serafina, with a softness that did not match the careful distance he used when speaking of pack business, told Elena that there was more beneath the surface than duty. "Why did I not know she had returned?" Elena asked. "I did not think it was important enough to mention," Damien said, and there was the smallest edge of impatience in his voice now, the tone of a man who wanted the conversation to end. "She is grieving, Elena. She lost her husband in the worst way a person can lose someone. I am simply making sure she has what she needs to recover. That is all this is." Elena nodded slowly, choosing for now to let the matter rest, though every instinct in her body told her this was not the whole truth. She had learned over the years that pushing Damien when he had decided to close a subject rarely brought her closer to honesty. Sometimes patience revealed more than confrontation ever could. That night, after Damien had fallen asleep beside her, an unusual occurrence in recent weeks, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the conversation. She thought about the letter with its tender words, about the portrait of Serafina Cole with her quiet sorrow, about the way Damien's voice had softened just slightly when he spoke her name. She thought about the years she had given to this pack, to this bond, to a marriage she had believed was strong enough to weather any storm. She did not sleep well, and when she finally drifted off in the hours before dawn, her dreams were filled with a woman she had never met, a widow with sorrowful eyes, standing at the edge of a fog-covered field, waiting. The next morning, Elena rose before the sun, dressed quietly, and made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. She would find out the truth for herself, whatever it cost her. She had spent 3 years building a life around trust, around the belief that her bond with Damien was unbreakable. But trust without truth was only a comfortable kind of blindness, and Elena Voss had never been a woman who chose comfort over clarity, not when everything she had built stood in the balance. She walked out into the cold morning air, the mist still clinging low to the ground, and looked toward the eastern edge of the territory, toward the old Cole estate that stood somewhere beyond the tree line, hidden by distance and fog and whatever secrets Damien was keeping from her. Whatever waited for her there, she told herself she was ready to face it. She did not yet know how wrong that certainty would prove to be, or how much her life was about to change because of a letter she was never supposed to read. The old Cole estate rose out of the morning mist like something from a memory rather than a real place, its stone walls covered in ivy that had grown wild in the 2 years since anyone had properly maintained it. Elena approached on foot, leaving her horse tied a good distance away, moving through the trees with the quiet steps that came naturally to a wolf who had spent her whole life learning how to move without being seen. She was not sure what she expected to find, only that she needed to see it with her own eyes. The estate showed signs of recent life. Fresh wheel tracks marked the muddy path leading to the front gate, and smoke rose thin and steady from one of the chimneys. Someone had been keeping the grounds tidy in patches, clearing the path near the door even as ivy swallowed the rest of the building. Elena crouched behind a low stone wall at the edge of the property and watched. It did not take long before the front door opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl the color of autumn leaves, her dark hair pulled back loosely, strands escaping to frame a face that Elena recognized instantly from the portrait in the archive room. Serafina Cole looked thinner than she had in her wedding photograph, her cheeks hollow, in a way that spoke of grief rather than illness, but there was still something striking about her, a quiet elegance that lingered even in sorrow. Serafina stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out over the misty grounds as though waiting for something, or someone. Elena's heart began to beat faster, and she pressed herself lower behind the wall, watching as the sound of hooves approached from the northern path. A moment later, Damien rode into view, dismounting near the gate with the easy grace of a man who had made this journey many times before. Elena watched her husband walk toward Serafina Cole, and she watched the way the widow's face changed the moment she saw him, brightening in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude for a debt of honor. Damien climbed the porch steps and took both of Serafina's hands in his, and though Elena could not hear their words from this distance, she did not need to. The language of bodies told her everything she needed to know. This was not a king visiting a widow out of duty. This was something else entirely, something soft and familiar, that had clearly grown over weeks, perhaps months, of visits Elena had known nothing about. She forced herself to stay hidden, to watch a little longer, telling herself she needed proof before she allowed her heart to break completely. Damien and Serafina walked together into the house, and the door closed behind them, leaving Elena alone in the cold morning, with a hollow feeling spreading through her chest like ice water. She did not go inside. She did not confront them. Instead, she made her way back through the trees to her horse, moving on legs that felt unsteady beneath her, and rode back toward the pack house, in a silence that matched the fog rolling across the fields. Halfway home, she stopped her horse beside a quiet stream and allowed herself, for the first time since she had found the letter, to cry. She cried not just for what she had seen, but for every excuse she had accepted over the past months, every late night she had explained away, every distance she had blamed on the weight of leadership rather than the weight of a secret. She cried for the years she had given to a bond she believed was unbreakable, and for the version of herself who had trusted so completely that she had ignored every warning sign along the way. By the time she reached the pack house, she had wiped her face clean and settled her expression into the calm mask she had perfected over years of public life. She could not let the pack see her unravel. Not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of what she was facing. She spent the rest of the day attending to her duties as Luna, overseeing the healing house, meeting with the pack's youngest mothers, to discuss the coming winter's supplies, smiling and nodding, through conversations that felt impossibly distant from the storm raging inside her. That evening, Damien returned to the pack house in good spirits, kissing her cheek as he passed through the great hall, telling her about a productive meeting with the southern packs regarding trade routes. Elena watched him lie to her face with such ease that she wondered how many other lies had come this smoothly over the past months, how many other stories had been woven so carefully that she had never thought to question them. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into his chair at dinner, his tone warm and easy. "Quiet," Elena said, keeping her voice steady. "I spent time with the healers. There is concern about supplies for the winter months." "I trust your judgment on such matters completely," Damien said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice, the kind that made the betrayal cut even deeper. He believed, perhaps, that he could hold both things at once, his affection for her and his growing attachment to Serafina Cole, as though loyalty could be divided without consequence. Elena said nothing more about the estate or the widow that evening, choosing instead to watch and wait, gathering strength for whatever conversation would eventually need to happen. She was not ready to confront him yet, not until she understood why this had happened, not until she had decided what she wanted to do about a truth that threatened to unravel everything she had built her life around. Over the following days, she began paying closer attention to patterns she had previously dismissed. She noticed how often Damien mentioned matters of honor regarding fallen warriors, how frequently his private meetings coincided with reports from scouts stationed near the eastern border. She noticed the way certain pack members, particularly Nathan Cole, seemed to grow quiet whenever the topic of the Cole estate arose in conversation, as though they knew something they were not saying. She found herself studying Nathan more closely during council meetings, watching for any sign that he might know the truth of what was happening between Damien and Serafina. Nathan had been Damien's closest friend since childhood, loyal to a fault, the kind of second-in-command who would follow his alpha into fire without question. If anyone in the pack knew what was truly happening, it would be him. One evening, after a long council session discussing border patrols, Elena found a moment alone with Nathan in the corridor outside the Great Hall. She approached carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone testing dangerous ground. "Nathan," she said, "I wanted to ask you about the Cole estate. Damien mentioned some concerns there recently." Nathan's expression flickered, just barely, the same kind of hesitation she had noticed in Damien when she first asked about Serafina. "The estate is being looked after," he said carefully. "Damien takes the debt to General Cole very seriously." "Of course," Elena said, watching him closely. "It must be difficult for Serafina, losing her husband the way she did." "It has been hard on everyone who knew Marcus," Nathan said, and for a moment something like sympathy crossed his face, though whether it was sympathy for Serafina or for Elena herself, she could not tell. He was a good man, a good friend to Damien. "Yes," Elena said quietly. "I imagine that friendship carries a great deal of weight." Nathan met her eyes then, and for just a moment, she thought she saw something like warning in his expression, as though he wanted to tell her more, but did not dare cross whatever line of loyalty bound him to his alpha. "Elena," he said carefully, "if there is something troubling you, you should speak with Damien directly. He would want to know if something weighed on your heart." It was not an answer, but it was also not a denial, and Elena filed away the exchange as one more piece of a puzzle that was slowly, painfully coming together. She thanked Nathan for his time and walked away, her mind already turning toward the question of what to do next. She spent that night awake again, staring at the ceiling beside a husband who slept peacefully, untroubled by the weight of secrets that were slowly destroying the woman beside him. She thought about confronting him directly, about demanding the truth in a way that left no room for careful explanations or half-honest answers. But some part of her, the part that had loved this man for 5 years, still wanted to give him a chance to come to her on his own, to choose honesty before she forced his hand. She decided to wait a little longer, to watch a little more closely, to gather enough certainty that when the moment came to speak the truth aloud, there would be no room left for denial. She did not yet know how much that decision would cost her, or how close she already stood to a discovery that would leave no doubt at all about the shape of her husband's heart. The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm of ordinary duties, layered over extraordinary pain. Elena continued her work as Luna, continued smiling through council meetings and pack gatherings, continued sharing meals and quiet evenings with a husband whose affection now felt like a performance she could see through completely. She watched him more closely than she ever had before, cataloging every small absence, every soft change in his voice when certain names arose in conversation, every late night that stretched a little longer than the one before. She began to understand that this was not a passing moment of weakness, not a single mistake born of grief and comfort. This was something that had grown slowly, deliberately, over weeks that had turned into months, a second life her husband had built alongside the one he shared with her, hidden behind duty and honor and careful lies. And somewhere in the quiet ache of that understanding, Elena Voss began to feel something shift inside her, a hardening resolve replacing the soft trust that had once defined her marriage. She was done waiting for explanations that never fully satisfied her questions. She was done accepting excuses that grew thinner with each passing week. Whatever waited at the end of this path, whatever truth she was moving toward with slow and careful steps, she intended to face it fully, with clear eyes and a steady heart, no matter how much it would cost her to finally see everything Damien had been hiding. Weeks passed, and the visits to the Cole estate grew more frequent rather than less. Elena tracked them quietly, noting the days Damien left before dawn and returned well after the moon had risen, always with the same explanation waiting on his lips before she even had to ask. Border concerns, honor debts, matters too delicate to share. The words had become so familiar that she could recite them in her sleep, and each time he spoke them, something in her chest grew a little colder, a little more distant from the man she had once trusted without question. She began to notice changes in Damien himself, subtle shifts that told her this was not simply an obligation of honor being carried out reluctantly. He hummed sometimes when he thought no one was listening, a habit she had not heard from him in years. He seemed lighter after his visits to the estate, his shoulders less burdened, his laughter coming easier at dinner, even as his attention toward her grew thinner. It was as though some part of him had found relief in another woman's company, relief he no longer sought from his own mate. Elena spent long hours in the pack archives, reading through old records of mate bonds and the ancient laws governing them, searching for any guidance on what a Luna should do when her bond began to weaken through no fault of her own. The text spoke of loyalty as a living thing, something that had to be tended and protected on both sides, and warned that a bond stretched too thin by divided hearts could fray until it broke entirely, leaving both partners diminished by the loss. She found herself wondering, in the quiet hours of those long nights, whether her bond with Damien had already begun to break. She no longer felt the same warmth radiating from him that she once had, the invisible thread that mates described feeling even when apart. In its place was something hollow, a distance that grew wider with every visit he made to the eastern estate, every soft word he spoke about a widow's grief that had somehow become his own private comfort. One afternoon, while walking through the pack gardens with Grace Whitmore, one of the elder healers who had served the pack for over 30 years, Elena found herself asking questions she had been afraid to voice aloud to anyone else. Grace had always been a woman of quiet wisdom, someone who had watched generations of alphas and lunas rise and fall, and Elena trusted her more than most in the pack. "Grace," Elena said carefully, as they walked among the winter herbs that still clung stubbornly to life in the cold air. "Have you ever known a mate bond to weaken because one partner's heart turned elsewhere?" Grace paused, her weathered hands resting on the edge of a stone planter, and studied Elena's face with the careful attention of someone who understood more than she was being told. "I have seen it happen twice in my lifetime," she said slowly. "It is a slow kind of grief, watching a bond fade, while still standing beside the person causing it to fade. The pain comes not just from the betrayal itself, but from the loss of certainty in everything you once believed to be true." "What happens to the bond, in the end?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That depends on the one who was wronged," Grace said. Some choose to fight for what remains, believing love strong enough can mend anything. Others choose to walk away before the bond fully breaks, understanding that some wounds cannot heal, while the one causing them remains close. There is no shame in either choice, child. Only you can know which path honors your own heart. Elena thanked Grace for her honesty and continued her walk alone, turning the words over in her mind. She was not yet ready to choose a path, not until she understood the full truth of what was happening between Damien and Serafina Cole. But Grace's words settled into her, like a seed planted in patient soil, waiting for the right season to grow into something she could act upon. That evening, Damien returned from another visit to the estate, looking more troubled than usual, his expression heavy with something Elena had not seen from him in months. He sat across from her at dinner in silence for a long while, pushing food around his plate without eating, until finally he spoke. Serafina has had a difficult week, he said, as though offering an explanation Elena had not asked for. The anniversary of Marcus's death approaches. She struggles greatly with the memory of how he died. Elena studied her husband's face, searching for the calculated distance she had grown used to seeing whenever this subject arose. But instead, she found something rawer, something that looked almost like genuine worry for another person's suffering. It was a small thing, but it told her more than any letter or conversation had told her yet. Whatever Damien felt for Serafina Cole, it had grown beyond simple comfort offered out of duty. It had become something he carried with him, something that weighed on his heart the way only real affection could. You care for her deeply, Elena said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact she could no longer deny. Damien's eyes rose to meet hers, and for a moment, something like guilt flickered across his features before he composed himself again. She has suffered greatly, he said carefully. It would be cruel not to care about her pain. That is not what I asked, Elena said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them, filled with words neither of them was ready to speak aloud. Finally, Damien set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between apology and defensiveness. Elena, you are my mate, nothing changes that. I am simply trying to honor a debt to a fallen friend by caring for the widow he left behind. And is that all this is? Elena asked. Honoring a debt? Damien did not answer right away, and in that hesitation, Elena felt the last remaining piece of denial she had been clinging to finally crumble away. Whatever this was between her husband and Serafina Cole, it had grown far beyond the boundaries of honor and duty, into territory that threatened everything Elena had built her life around. I love you, Damien said finally, reaching across the table for her hand. You are my Luna, my queen. Nothing will ever change that. Elena let him hold her hand, though something inside her had already begun the slow process of pulling away, of protecting what remained of her heart from a wound that grew deeper with every passing week. She smiled at him, the same practiced smile she had perfected over years of public duty, and said nothing more about the matter that evening. But inside, a decision was beginning to take shape, one she was not yet ready to speak aloud, not until she had gathered the final piece of proof that would leave no room for doubt. Days later, a young pack scout named Oliver Bramwell approached Elena privately during her morning rounds through the training grounds, his expression uneasy in a way that immediately caught her attention. Oliver was young, barely 20, one of the newer recruits assigned to patrol the eastern border where the Cole estate stood. Luna, he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear, there is something I feel I should tell you, though I fear it is not my place. You may speak freely with me, Oliver, Elena said gently, recognizing the nervousness in his young face. During my patrols near the eastern estate, he said, his voice dropping lower still, I have seen the Alpha King's horse, tied outside, long past midnight, on several occasions. I did not think much of it at first, given his duty to protect the widow there. But last week, I saw something through the window as I passed, and I have not been able to forget it since. Elena's heart began to pound, though her face remained carefully composed. What did you see, Oliver? The young scout hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the position he found himself in, torn between loyalty to his Alpha and the growing certainty that his Luna deserved to know the truth. I saw the Alpha King and the widow together, Luna, in a manner that did not seem to match simple concern for a grieving woman. I am sorry to bring you such news, but I could not in good conscience keep silent when I saw how it might affect you. Elena thanked the young scout for his honesty and courage, assuring him that his loyalty to the truth would not be forgotten, and sent him back to his duties with a heavy heart weighing on her chest. She had suspected this truth for weeks now, had seen enough with her own eyes to know the shape of what was happening. But hearing it confirmed by another witness, someone with no reason to lie or exaggerate, settled the matter with a finality that left no room for further doubt. That night, as she lay beside Damien once more, listening to his steady breathing in the darkness, Elena made a decision she had been circling for weeks without allowing herself to fully commit to it. She would see the truth for herself one final time, with complete certainty, before she decided what to do about the marriage that was slowly dissolving around her. She would not act in anger or rush toward a confrontation built on suspicion alone. She would gather the last piece of undeniable proof, and then she would decide, with clear eyes and a steady heart, exactly what her future would look like. The night Elena chose to see the truth for herself arrived cold and clear, the kind of night where the moon hung bright and full over the Blackthorn territory, casting silver light across the frozen fields. She waited until Damien left the pack house well after midnight, claiming urgent business at the eastern border, and gave him a full hour's head start before she followed, moving through the trees with the silent grace that had once made her one of the finest trackers in the pack. She reached the edge of the Cole estate grounds just as the last candle in the front window flickered out, replaced by the softer glow of a single lamp burning somewhere deeper inside the house. She moved carefully along the tree line, staying low, staying quiet, until she found a position near the side of the house where a gap in the curtains offered a narrow view into the room beyond. What she saw confirmed everything she had feared, and everything Oliver Bramwell had tried to warn her about. Damien stood near the hearth with Seraphina Cole, and the way they looked at each other left no room for any interpretation beyond the obvious truth. This was not a king comforting a grieving widow out of duty or honor. This was two people who had built something private and intimate together, something that had grown roots deep enough to survive months of careful hiding. Elena watched Damien reach out and brush a strand of hair from Seraphina's face, watched the widow lean into his touch with the ease of familiarity, watched her husband's expression soften into something she had not seen directed at her in longer than she wanted to admit. The pain of witnessing it firsthand was sharper than she had expected, a physical ache that settled deep in her chest and threatened to steal the breath from her lungs. She did not linger longer than necessary. She had seen enough to know the truth in full, undeniable clarity, and no further proof was needed to confirm what her heart had already understood weeks ago. She turned away from the window and made her way back through the trees, her steps steady despite the storm raging inside her, her mind already moving past shock and into the cold, clear territory of decision. By the time she reached the pack house, the sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of approaching dawn. She did not go to bed. Instead, she sat in the quiet study that had once belonged to her own family before her marriage to Damien, and she allowed herself, for the final time, to grieve fully for the marriage she had believed in for 5 years. She cried until there were no tears left, until the ache in her chest settled into something quieter, something that felt less like devastation and more like resolve. When Damien returned home just before sunrise, he found Elena already dressed and composed, sitting calmly in the great hall, as though she had been awake for hours, attending to pack matters. He greeted her with the same warm smile he always wore, utterly unaware that his secret had been fully exposed the night before. "You are up early," he said, kissing her cheek in a gesture that now felt hollow and practiced rather than genuine. "I could not sleep," Elena said simply, and it was, in its own way, the truest thing she had said to him in weeks. She spent that day going through the motions of her duties as Luna, attending council meetings, overseeing preparations for the coming winter festival, speaking with pack members about matters both large and small. But throughout it all, a quiet plan had begun forming in her mind, one that required patience and careful timing to execute, without drawing unwanted attention before she was ready. She began, in small and careful ways, to prepare for a departure she had not yet announced to anyone. She reached out quietly to Grace Whitmore, asking discreet questions about neighboring packs who might be willing to offer temporary shelter to someone seeking distance from difficult circumstances. Grace, sensing the weight behind Elena's careful questions, offered the name of the Fairwood Pact to the West, known for their fair leadership and their willingness to offer refuge to those in need, without asking too many questions. Elena also began quietly gathering her personal belongings, the items that were truly hers, rather than gifts from Damien or possessions tied to her role as Luna. She moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to raise suspicion among the household staff who might report unusual behavior back to their alpha. Every step she took was measured, every decision weighed carefully against the life she was preparing to leave behind. She did not confront Damien immediately, though the temptation grew stronger with each passing day. Some part of her wanted to see if he would come to her on his own, if some flicker of conscience might finally push him toward honesty before she was forced to reveal what she already knew. But as the days passed, and his visits to the Eastern estate continued without pause, without any sign of guilt or hesitation, Elena understood that honesty was not coming. If she wanted the truth spoken aloud, she would have to be the one to speak it. She chose an evening nearly 2 weeks after her final visit to the estate, waiting until the household had settled for the night and she and Damien were alone in their private quarters. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, imagining every possible reaction, every excuse he might offer, every attempt he might make to minimize what he had done. But when the moment finally arrived, she found that all her rehearsed words fell away, replaced by a simple, steady clarity. "I know about Serafina," she said quietly, watching Damien's face carefully as the words landed. The color drained from his face almost instantly, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that would not come. Elena waited, giving him the space to respond, though she already understood that no response he offered would change what she had decided. "Elena," he said finally, his voice rough with something that sounded like genuine regret, "it is not what you think." "I saw you together," Elena said simply. "With my own eyes. There is no version of what I saw that could be misunderstood as anything other than what it was." Damien's shoulders slumped, and for the first time in weeks, the careful mask he had maintained cracked completely, revealing something raw and conflicted beneath. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "It began slowly, out of grief and comfort, and before I understood what was happening, it had become something I could not simply walk away from." "You had a choice," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the ache building in her chest. "Every single day, you had a choice to walk away, to come to me with honesty, to protect what we built together. Instead, you chose to hide, to lie, to let me discover the truth on my own, rather than facing it with courage." Damien reached for her hand, and Elena allowed him to hold it, though she felt nothing of the warmth that touch had once carried. "I love you," he said. "You are my Luna, my mate. Please, Elena, we can find a way through this." "Do you love her too?" Elena asked quietly. The silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. Damien did not deny it. He could not deny it, and in his silence, Elena found the final piece of clarity she had needed to move forward with the decision she had already made weeks ago. "I am leaving," she said simply, "not because I do not still care about what we once had, but because I cannot remain bonded to a heart that belongs, at least in part, to someone else. I deserve more than a divided loyalty, Damien. I deserve a mate who chooses me completely, without hesitation, without secrets." "Elena, please," Damien said, his voice breaking with something that sounded like genuine desperation now that the reality of losing her had become undeniable. "Do not do this. We can work through it. I will end things with Serafina. I will do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." "You had every opportunity to end things with her before I ever discovered the truth," Elena said, pulling her hand gently away from his grasp. "The fact that you are only offering to end it now, after being caught, tells me everything I need to know about where your heart truly stands." She left him sitting alone in their private quarters that night, his face buried in his hands, the weight of what he had lost finally beginning to settle over him. Elena walked to the room where she had quietly packed her belongings over the past 2 weeks, and she spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing for the final steps of her departure, steady in her resolve despite the grief still lingering in her heart. Whatever came next, she knew now with absolute certainty that she could not remain in a marriage built on a foundation that had already crumbled beneath her feet. Elena rose before dawn, the sky still holding on to the deep blue of night, and moved through the pack house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had planned every step of this moment for weeks. She had already arranged for a small carriage to wait for her at the edge of the northern road, hidden from the main gates where guards might question her sudden departure. Grace Whitmore had helped her secure passage to the Fairwood Pack, sending word ahead through trusted channels that a friend in need of shelter would be arriving within days. She moved through her private chambers one final time, gathering the last of her belongings into a single travel bag. She left behind the jewelry Damien had given her over the years, the fine clothes that marked her as Luna of Blackthorn, everything that tied her to a title she no longer wished to carry. She took only what was truly hers, a few personal items from her childhood, letters from her late mother, and the simple clothes she had worn before she ever became anyone's queen. Before leaving, she sat at the writing desk near the window and composed a single note, choosing her words with the same careful precision she had used throughout every step of the past weeks. She did not write pages of explanation or accusation. She wrote only what needed to be said, knowing that Damien would understand the full weight of her meaning without further elaboration. "You made your choice the night you touched her," the note read. "I am making mine now." She left the note on the desk where he would find it, and she walked out of the pack house into the cold morning air without looking back at the building that had been her home for 5 years. The carriage waited exactly where she had arranged, and as she climbed inside and the wheels began to turn, carrying her away from Blackthorn territory, she felt something inside her chest that surprised her. Beneath the grief and the ache of loss, there was also a quiet sense of relief, the feeling of finally releasing a weight she had carried silently for far too long. The journey to Fairwood territory took the better part of 2 days, winding through forests and along quiet roads that grew increasingly unfamiliar as she moved further from everything she had known. She spent the long hours of travel staring out the carriage window, watching the landscape shift from the familiar hills of Blackthorn to the denser woodlands that marked the beginning of Fairwood lands, her mind turning over the events of the past weeks again and again, searching for some sign she might have missed earlier, some moment where she could have prevented the slow unraveling of her marriage. But the more she reflected, the more she understood that this outcome had never truly been within her control. She could not force loyalty from a heart that had already begun to wander. She could not manufacture honesty from a man who had chosen secrecy over truth at every turn. The only choice that had ever truly belonged to her was the choice she had finally made, to walk away from a bond that no longer served the woman she wanted to become. Word of Elena's departure reached the Blackthorn pack within hours of her leaving, spreading through the household staff first, then through the training grounds, then through every corner of the territory, with the speed that only truly significant news could travel. By midday, the entire pack knew that their Luna had left, though the exact reasons remained the subject of quiet speculation among those who had not yet learned the full truth. Damien found the note on his writing desk shortly after waking, and the household staff later reported hearing something break in his private chambers, though none dared enter to check on their alpha in the raw aftermath of his discovery. He did not emerge from his quarters until well past noon, and when he finally did, his expression carried a weight that unsettled even the most seasoned members of his council. Nathan Cole was the first to approach him, finding Damien standing alone in the great hall, staring at nothing in particular, his usual composure entirely absent. "Damien," Nathan said carefully. "What happened?" "She knows," Damien said simply, his voice hollow. "About Serafina. She left this morning." Nathan's face fell, though something in his expression suggested this news did not come as a complete surprise. "I feared this might happen eventually," he admitted quietly. "I told you weeks ago that these visits carried risk, that Elena was not a woman easily deceived." "I did not think it would end this way," Damien said, sinking into the nearest chair, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed them against his face. "I thought I could manage both, honor my debt to Marcus's memory, while still protecting what Elena and I had built together. I was wrong." "You cannot divide loyalty and expect it to remain whole," Nathan said, his voice gentle but firm, the words of a friend willing to speak hard truths, even when they were not welcome. Elena deserved better than a heart split between two women. We all knew this, Damien, even if none of us said it aloud until now. The words settled over Damien like a physical weight, and for the first time since the affair had begun, He allowed himself to fully consider the cost of what he had done, not just to Elena, but to the entire pack that depended on the stability of its Alpha and Luna standing united. Without Elena beside him, the foundation of everything he had built suddenly felt fragile in ways he had never anticipated. News of the Luna's departure spread beyond the pack house within days, reaching the ears of neighboring territories and rival packs who had long watched Blackthorn's strength with a mixture of respect and wariness. Whispers began to circulate that the great alliance between Alpha King Damian Ashford and his devoted Luna had crumbled, and with those whispers came questions about the stability of Blackthorn leadership that had never been raised before. Within the pack itself, opinions divided sharply. Some members, particularly the younger warriors who had grown up idolizing Damian's strength and leadership, defended their Alpha, insisting that whatever happened between him and his Luna was a private matter that should not affect their loyalty to him as a leader. Others, particularly those who had worked closely with Elena over the years and witnessed firsthand her dedication to the pack's well-being, felt a growing anger at how she had been treated, and their loyalty began to shift in ways that troubled the pack's stability. Grace Whitmore, though she had helped facilitate Elena's departure, remained at Blackthorn, continuing her duties as healer while quietly observing the growing tension among pack members. She heard the whispered conversations in the healing house, the concerned murmurs among mothers who worried about what kind of leadership their Alpha could provide when he could not even maintain loyalty within his own marriage. She held this pack together as much as he did, Grace said quietly to another healer one evening, as they prepared herbs for the coming winter season. Perhaps more than he did, if we are honest. Her steady hand guided as many decisions as his did, even if the pack did not always recognize her contribution as clearly as his. Meanwhile, at the Fairwood territory, Elena arrived exhausted but resolute, greeted by Alpha Edward Hartley, a fair and thoughtful leader who had built his own pack's reputation on careful diplomacy rather than aggressive expansion. He welcomed her without judgment, offering shelter and privacy while she adjusted to the enormous shift her life had just undergone. "You are welcome here for as long as you need," Edward told her during their first meeting, his tone warm but respectful of the clear boundaries she needed. "Grace spoke highly of your character, and I have heard enough about your work at Blackthorn to know that any pack would be fortunate to have your guidance, even temporarily." Elena thanked him for his hospitality, though the enormity of her new circumstances still felt overwhelming in those early days. She had left behind not just a marriage, but an entire identity built around being Luna of Blackthorn, and she found herself uncertain, for the first time in years, of exactly who she was without that title attached to her name. She spent her first week at Fairwood, mostly in quiet reflection, walking the unfamiliar grounds, observing the rhythms of a pack that operated differently from the one she had known for 5 years. She noticed how Alpha Hartley consulted regularly with his council before making decisions, how the pack's female warriors held positions of genuine authority rather than simply ceremonial respect, how the entire community seemed to function with a kind of balance that Blackthorn, for all its strength, had never quite achieved. Slowly, as the days passed, Elena began to feel something shifting inside her, a quiet strength rebuilding itself from the ashes of what she had lost. She was not simply a wounded former Luna seeking refuge. She was a woman who had led thousands of pack members through difficult seasons, who had negotiated peace treaties and organized relief efforts, who possessed skills and wisdom that extended far beyond the title she had left behind at Blackthorn. The realization did not erase her grief, but it began to offer something new to stand on, a foundation built entirely on her own strength, rather than on a bond that had ultimately proven unworthy of her trust. 2 weeks after Elena's departure, the mood within the Blackthorn pack had shifted from shocked whispers into something more openly troubled. The training grounds, once filled with the confident energy of warriors who trusted their leadership completely, now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that even the youngest recruits could sense. Damian noticed it in the way pack members addressed him now, their greetings still respectful, but carrying a hesitance that had never existed before. He had thrown himself into pack business with a kind of frantic energy since Elena's departure, attending every council meeting, overseeing every patrol assignment personally, as though sheer effort might somehow fill the void left by her absence. But the pack's elders, wise from decades of watching leaders rise and fall, recognized the difference between genuine strength and a man drowning beneath the weight of his own choices. Margaret Ellsworth, the eldest of the PAC's council members, had served under 3 different alphas during her long life, and had watched Damien grow from a young pup into the leader he had become. She requested a private audience with him nearly 3 weeks after Elena's departure, and Damien, sensing the gravity in her request, agreed without hesitation. "Damien," Margaret said, once they were alone in his study, "I have watched this PAC through many seasons of change, but I have never seen the foundation shake quite as it has since Elena left us." "I am handling PAC matters as capably as ever," Damien said, though even he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. "Capability was never the concern," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her advanced age. "It is trust, Damien." Elena's presence beside you was not simply ceremonial. Her steady judgment balanced your instincts. Her relationships with PAC members, especially the mothers and healers who form the backbone of our community, held this PAC together in ways you may not have fully appreciated until now. Damien said nothing, staring at the papers on his desk without truly seeing them, and Margaret continued, her tone softening slightly, though her words remained firm. "The PAC does not simply mourn the loss of a beloved Luna, Damien. They question what kind of judgment led a king to risk everything he built for a private affair, kept hidden even from those closest to him. They wonder what other decisions might carry similar hidden costs." "I made a mistake," Damien said quietly. "I am not proud of the choices I made regarding Serafina. But I have not failed this PAC in matters of leadership." "Perhaps not yet," Margaret said, rising slowly from her chair. "But loyalty, once shaken, does not simply return to its previous strength through good intentions alone. You will need to prove yourself worthy of this PAC's trust again, Damien, through actions rather than words. I fear that path will be longer and harder than you currently understand." Her words lingered long after she left his study, and Damien found himself, for perhaps the first time since the affair had begun, truly confronting the scope of what he had risked and lost. He thought of Elena's steady presence beside him during every difficult council meeting, her ability to calm tensions between rival factions within the PAC, her genuine care for every member of the community, regardless of their standing. He had taken all of it for granted, believing it would remain constant, even as he divided his heart elsewhere. Meanwhile, the situation with Serafina Cole had grown increasingly complicated. Word of the affair had reached her as well, and rather than bringing her comfort, the PAC's growing resentment toward the circumstances of Elena's departure had begun to isolate the widow further than her grief already had. She found herself the subject of harsh whispers whenever she ventured near the main PAC grounds, blamed by many for the dissolution of a marriage that had once symbolized Blackthorn's strength and stability. Serafina approached Damien one evening at the estate, her expression troubled in a way that went beyond her usual grief. "Damien," she said quietly, "I think I need to leave Blackthorn territory. My presence here causes more harm than the debt of honor you owe Marcus could ever justify." "You do not need to leave," Damien said, though even his own voice lacked conviction. "This is not your fault. The choices made were mine." "Perhaps," Serafina said, "but I cannot ignore what my presence has cost your PAC, and what it has cost the woman who once stood as its Luna. I grieve for Marcus still, Damien, and I have found comfort in your company these past months. But I cannot build something lasting on the wreckage of another woman's marriage. It would dishonor both Marcus's memory and whatever affection you and I have shared." Damien sat with her words for a long moment, understanding the truth in them even as part of him wished to deny it. "Where will you go?" "I have family in the Southern Territories," Serafina said. "It is time I returned to them, to rebuild whatever life remains for me, away from all of this." Within days, Serafina had quietly departed Blackthorn territory, leaving behind the estate that had once symbolized both her grief and her growing connection with Damien. Her departure did little to ease the tension that had settled over the PAC, however, as the damage to Damien's standing had already taken root, far beyond the question of whether the affair continued. The PAC's council, led increasingly by voices like Margaret Ellsworth and other elders concerned about the stability of leadership, began holding more frequent meetings, without Damien's direct involvement, discussing matters of succession and leadership structure that had never been questioned during the years of Elena's presence beside him. Nathan Cole found himself caught between loyalty to his lifelong friend and growing concern about whether Damien could rebuild the trust necessary to lead effectively. "The council grows restless," Nathan told Damien one evening, his tone carrying the weight of difficult news he did not wish to deliver. They speak of possible challenges to your leadership if stability does not return soon. Some even suggest reaching out to Elena, asking whether she might consider returning, not as your mate necessarily, but as a stabilizing presence the pack desperately needs. Would she even consider it? Damien asked, a flicker of hope crossing his tired features. I do not know, Nathan admitted, but I suspect the answer depends less on what the pack needs, and more on what Elena herself has decided about her own future. She left with clear resolve, Damien. I do not believe she will be easily persuaded to return to something she walked away from with such certainty. Damien spent that night alone in his private quarters, surrounded by the quiet emptiness that had once been filled with Elena's presence, and for the first time since her departure, he allowed himself to fully grieve what he had lost, not just a marriage, but the partnership that had made him a better leader than he could ever be alone. The weight of that realization settled over him with crushing clarity, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that some losses could not simply be undone through apology or good intention. Some choices carried consequences that reshaped the entire course of a life, regardless of how deeply one wished to return to what came before. At Fairwood territory, Elena had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt increasingly like the foundation of a new life, rather than a temporary refuge. Alpha Edward Hartley had offered her a small cottage on the eastern edge of the pack grounds, private and quiet, surrounded by gardens that reminded her faintly of the ones she had tended back at Blackthorn, though these gardens belonged entirely to her own care now, free from any association with the marriage she had left behind. She spent her mornings walking the grounds, observing the daily rhythms of a pack she was slowly coming to understand, and her afternoons assisting where her skills proved useful, offering guidance on healing house organization, helping mediate a small dispute between two families over shared farmland, lending her experience wherever the Fairwood Council found it valuable. She did not seek out these opportunities aggressively, but her natural inclination toward service and problem-solving made it impossible for her to remain entirely idle, even in the midst of her own healing. Edward Hartley noticed her contributions quickly, and within a month of her arrival, he approached her with a proposal that surprised her with its directness. "Elena," he said, during a quiet evening meeting in his study, "I have watched how you carry yourself these past weeks, how naturally you step into roles of guidance and leadership, even without being asked. I would like to offer you a formal position within my council, advising on matters of diplomacy and pack welfare." Elena considered the offer carefully before responding, aware that accepting would mean taking her first true step toward rebuilding an identity separate from everything she had lost. "I would be honored," she said finally, "though I want to be clear that I do not seek this position out of any desire to replace what I left behind. I simply wish to use whatever skills I possess in service of a community that has shown me genuine kindness." "I understand completely," Edward said, "and I believe that is precisely why you would serve this council so well. You do not seek power for its own sake, Elena. You seek to serve those around you faithfully, and that quality is rare enough that I would be foolish not to recognize its value." Elena accepted the position, and over the following weeks, she threw herself into her new responsibilities with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. She helped negotiate a trade agreement between Fairwood and a smaller neighboring territory that had long struggled with resource shortages during winter months. She assisted in reorganizing the pack's healing house to better serve expecting mothers, drawing on lessons she had learned during her years at Blackthorn. Slowly, piece by piece, she began building something entirely her own, separate from the title of Luna that had once defined her existence. Word of her contributions at Fairwood began to spread beyond the immediate territory, carried by traders and travelers who moved between packs, sharing news of the former Blackthorn Luna, who had brought remarkable skill and steady wisdom to her new community. Some of this news inevitably found its way back to Blackthorn territory, reaching ears that included Nathan Cole, who mentioned it carefully to Damien during one of their private conversations. "Elena has taken a formal position, advising Alpha Hartley's council," Nathan said one evening, watching Damien's reaction carefully. "Word travels that she has already helped negotiate a significant trade agreement, and that Fairwood's healing house has improved considerably under her guidance." Damien absorbed this news in silence, feeling a complicated mixture of pride and grief settle over him. Part of him took genuine comfort in knowing Elena was thriving, despite everything she had endured, while another part of him mourned more deeply the loss of a partnership that had clearly been as valuable to her own growth as it had been to his leadership. He had not fully appreciated, until her absence made it undeniable, just how much of his own success had depended on her steady presence beside him. Meanwhile, at Blackthorn, the pack's stability continued to waver despite Damien's efforts to reassert his authority. The council grew increasingly divided, with some members openly questioning whether the pack needed new leadership entirely, arguing that a king who could not maintain loyalty within his own household had lost the moral authority necessary to lead effectively. Others remained loyal to Damien, arguing that personal mistakes should not overshadow years of capable leadership. But even this faction grew smaller, as the weeks passed without any sign of the stability the pack desperately needed. Margaret Ellsworth called for a formal council meeting nearly 2 months after Elena's departure, gathering the pack's most influential voices, to discuss the growing concerns about leadership stability. Damien attended, understanding the gravity of what this meeting represented, aware that his position as Alpha King now hung in a balance he had never anticipated needing to defend. "We do not gather today to challenge your right to lead," Margaret said carefully, addressing the assembled council with the weight of her decades of experience. "But we must address honestly the instability that has settled over this pack since Elena's departure. Trade negotiations with neighboring packs have grown more difficult, as our reputation for stable leadership has been called into question. Internal disputes that Elena once resolved with ease now linger unresolved, creating friction among families who once trusted their concerns would be heard and addressed fairly." Damien listened to each council member speak in turn, hearing the accumulated weight of concerns he had perhaps not fully recognized in the fog of his own grief and guilt. He understood, with growing clarity, that Elena's absence had created a genuine void in the pack's functioning, one that his own efforts, however sincere, had not managed to fill. "What do you propose?" Damien asked finally, his voice carrying none of the defensive edge it once might have held. "We propose that you consider reaching out to Elena," Margaret said, "not with any expectation that she return to her former role as your mate, for we understand that bridge may be permanently broken by your own choices. But perhaps as an advisor, in whatever capacity she might be willing to offer, given her deep understanding of this pack's needs, and her clear talent for the kind of leadership this community requires." Damien sat with the proposal for a long moment, understanding both the wisdom in the suggestion and the painful irony of it. To reach out to Elena now, after everything that had happened, felt like asking for a kindness he had no right to request. And yet the needs of the pack, the community that depended on stable and effective leadership, could not simply be set aside in favor of his own pride or discomfort. "I will consider it," he said finally, though the words carried little confidence about how such an approach might be received. He suspected, with a certainty that settled heavily in his chest, that Elena's answer would depend entirely on whether she believed anything genuine remained to be salvaged from the wreckage of what they had once shared, and increasingly, he feared the answer to that question was no. The letter arrived at Fairwood Territory nearly 3 months after Elena's departure from Blackthorn, carried by a young messenger who had traveled 2 full days to deliver it personally. Elena recognized Damien's handwriting immediately upon receiving it, and she held the sealed parchment for a long moment before deciding whether to open it at all, uncertain what new complications it might bring into the steady life she had begun rebuilding. She eventually opened it in the privacy of her cottage garden, sitting among the herbs she had planted with her own hands over the past months, and read through Damien's careful words describing the pack's growing instability, the council's concerns, and his own recognition of how much her presence had contributed to Blackthorn's strength. He did not ask for her return as his mate. He asked only whether she might consider offering guidance to the pack's council, in whatever limited capacity she felt comfortable providing, given the genuine need the community now faced. Elena read the letter twice before setting it aside, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions rise within her. Part of her recognized the genuine need behind his request, understanding that pack stability affected far more people than simply herself and Damien, extending to families and children who depended on strong leadership, regardless of the personal failures that had created the current crisis. But another part of her, the part still healing from months of betrayal and grief, hesitated at the thought of involving herself again in matters connected to a man who had broken her trust so completely. She sought counsel from Grace Whitmore, who had maintained occasional correspondence with Elena since her departure, offering updates on pack matters while respecting the boundaries Elena had established around her new life. Grace's response, when it arrived, offered wisdom without pressure, acknowledging the difficulty of the decision, while trusting Elena's judgment to know what path best served her own well-being. "You do not owe Blackthorn anything further," Grace wrote. "You gave that pack years of devoted service, and you left with your dignity intact, despite everything done to wound you. Whatever you decide, know that your worth was never dependent on that title, and it remains undiminished, regardless of whether you choose to help now." Elena also spoke with Edward Hartley, whose own perspective as a fellow leader offered a different angle on the question weighing on her mind. "You have built something valuable here at Fairwood," Edward said during their conversation. "Whatever assistance you might offer Blackthorn does not need to come at the expense of the life you have created for yourself. If you choose to help, let it be on your own terms, shaped by your own boundaries, not as a return to old patterns that once cost you so dearly." After days of careful consideration, Elena composed her response to Damien, choosing her words with the same precision she had used throughout every difficult decision of the past months. She agreed to offer limited guidance to the Blackthorn Council, but made clear that this assistance would come through correspondence and occasional formal meetings only, never as a return to her former role, and never involving any renewal of personal connection with Damien himself, beyond what pack business strictly required. Her letter arrived at Blackthorn with the careful boundaries clearly stated, and Damien read through her measured words with a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that reaching out might open some small door toward reconciliation, but Elena's response made clear that whatever door had once existed between them had closed permanently, replaced only by the practical necessity of ensuring pack stability for the sake of those who depended on it. He shared her response with the council, and Margaret Ellsworth nodded with quiet approval at the clear boundaries Elena had established. "This is wisdom," she said. "She offers what the pack genuinely needs, without sacrificing the life she has built for herself. It is more generosity than many would offer after being wronged so deeply." Over the following months, Elena's guidance, delivered through careful correspondence and occasional formal council meetings held with strict boundaries in place, helped gradually restore stability to Blackthorn territory. Trade agreements that had faltered began to recover as her insight helped navigate difficult negotiations from a distance. Internal disputes found resolution through frameworks she suggested, drawing on years of experience that the current council lacked without her presence. Slowly, the pack began to find its footing again, even as Elena maintained careful distance from any personal involvement with Damien, beyond what these formal interactions required. During this same period, Elena's reputation continued to grow beyond Fairwood territory, as word spread of the remarkable woman who had helped stabilize two different pack territories through her wisdom and diplomatic skill. Alphas from neighboring lands began seeking her counsel on various matters, recognizing in her a rare kind of leadership that combined genuine care for community well-being with the practical skill necessary to navigate complex political challenges. 6 months after her departure from Blackthorn, Elena received an invitation to join a newly formed council of regional alphas and advisors, a group dedicated to fostering peace and cooperation among territories that had historically struggled with conflict and mistrust. The invitation recognized her unique position as someone respected across multiple pack territories, trusted for her wisdom rather than any single loyalty to one particular pack or leader. She accepted the invitation, after careful consideration, understanding that this new role would allow her to build something entirely her own, separate from any connection to her former marriage or the title she had once carried as Blackthorn's Luna. She would serve not as anyone's mate or subordinate, but as an independent voice respected for her own merit, contributing to peace and stability across an entire region rather than a single territory. The first meeting of this regional council took place at a neutral location, chosen specifically for its accessibility to all participating packs, and Elena arrived prepared to take her seat among alphas and advisors who had gathered to address matters of shared concern across their territories. As she settled into her position at the council table, surrounded by leaders who respected her presence, not because of any title bestowed by marriage, but because of the genuine wisdom and skill she had demonstrated through her own actions, she felt something settle within her that had been missing since the earliest days of her departure from Blackthorn. She had rebuilt herself, piece by careful piece, from the wreckage of a marriage that had once defined her entire identity. She was no longer simply the Luna who had been wronged, the queen who had lost her king to another woman's comfort. She had become something entirely her own, respected and valued for the strength and wisdom she carried within herself, independent of any bond that had once seemed essential to her sense of worth. Whatever remained of her connection to Blackthorn now existed purely through practical necessity, a professional arrangement stripped of the personal devotion that had once made her vulnerable to the kind of heartbreak she had endured. She had found, in the aftermath of betrayal, a version of herself stronger and more complete than she had ever been, while standing beside a man whose loyalty had ultimately proven divided. A full year passed since the morning Elena had ridden away from Blackthorn territory in the cold light of dawn, and the changes that year had brought reshaped nearly every aspect of both her life and the pack she had left behind. The regional council she had joined months earlier had grown into a respected institution across the northern territories, credited with resolving 3 separate border disputes that might otherwise have escalated into costly conflicts between neighboring packs. Elena's voice had become one of the most trusted at that table. Her counsel sought, not because of any title inherited through marriage, but because of skill and wisdom she had built entirely through her own effort and character. At Blackthorn, the pack had found a fragile but genuine stability under Damien's continued leadership, aided significantly by the careful boundaries of guidance Elena had offered from a distance during the difficult months following her departure. The council no longer spoke openly of challenging his authority, though the shadow of what had happened lingered in quieter ways, a reminder that trust once broken required far longer to rebuild than it had taken to shatter in the first place. Serafina Cole had settled quietly into life among her family in the Southern Territories, and word occasionally reached Blackthorn of her gradual healing, free from the complicated weight of an affair that had cost so much to those around her. She had not sought further contact with Damien since her departure, understanding perhaps more clearly than he initially had that whatever comfort they had found together had never been strong enough a foundation to justify the damage it caused. Damien himself had changed in ways that those closest to him noticed gradually over the passing months. The easy confidence that had once defined his leadership had been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate, as though he now understood the weight of consequences in a way his earlier years of leadership had never required him to learn. He led the pack with genuine effort, working to earn back trust that could not simply be demanded through his position alone, but had to be rebuilt through consistent action over time. It was during a gathering of the regional council, held at a grand hall in neutral territory that served as the meeting place for the assembled alphas and advisors, that Damien found himself present as Blackthorn's representative for a discussion regarding trade routes that affected multiple territories throughout the region. He had known, in the weeks leading up to this gathering, that Elena would likely be present given her position on the council, and he had spent considerable time preparing himself for the possibility of seeing her again after so many months of only exchanging careful, formal correspondence. The hall was filled with representatives from a dozen different territories, and Damien found a seat near the back, observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone determined to represent his pack's interests well, rather than draw unnecessary attention to his own presence. When Elena rose to address the council regarding a proposed framework for resolving future border disputes, Damien watched her, with a complicated mixture of pride and lingering grief that he had learned, over the past year, to carry, without letting it consume him entirely. She spoke with the same steady confidence he remembered from their years together, though something in her bearing now carried an additional weight of authority, earned through her own independent accomplishments, rather than borrowed from any title or marriage. The assembled alphas listened to her proposal with genuine respect, several nodding along as she outlined a system of mediation that drew on lessons learned from her work at both Blackthorn and Fairwood, combined with insights gathered from her broader experience across the regional council. When she finished speaking, the proposal received widespread support, and the council moved quickly toward formal adoption of the framework she had presented. Damien watched the proceedings with a quiet understanding settling over him, recognizing fully, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, exactly what he had lost, the night he had allowed his heart to divide between 2 women, rather than remaining fully devoted to the one who had stood beside him as his equal partner in leadership. After the formal session concluded, Damien found himself in the courtyard outside the Grand Hall, watching from a respectful distance as various representatives approached Elena to offer congratulations on her successful proposal, engaging her in conversations about implementation details and future collaboration. She moved through these interactions with grace and confidence, her presence commanding respect without any need for the kind of title that had once defined her worth in his eyes and in the eyes of others. She noticed him eventually, standing alone at the edge of the courtyard, and after concluding her conversation with a neighboring alpha, she walked toward him with the same steady composure she carried in every other aspect of her new life. "Damien," she said simply, her tone polite, but carrying none of the warmth that had once characterized their conversations together. "Elena," he replied, finding himself momentarily at a loss for words, despite the months he had spent imagining what he might say if this moment ever arrived. "Your proposal was remarkable. The Council's response speaks to how much you have accomplished since leaving Blackthorn." "Thank you," Elena said simply, her expression giving little away about what she truly felt in this unexpected reunion. "I understand the pack has found stability again, at least according to the reports Grace has shared with me. That is good news for everyone who depends on Blackthorn's well-being." "It is, in large part, thanks to guidance you have offered despite everything," Damien said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude beneath the awkwardness of the conversation. "I understand now, perhaps more clearly than I ever did while you stood beside me, exactly how much your presence contributed to whatever success I achieved as Alpha King." Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, though it remained clear that whatever warmth had once existed between them as mates had been replaced by something more distant and measured. "I am glad the pack has found stability," she said finally. "Whatever happened between us personally, I never wished ill upon the community that depended on strong leadership. They deserved better than the turmoil my departure created, even if the circumstances that caused it were beyond anyone's control but your own choices." "I know I cannot undo what I did," Damien said quietly. "I have spent this past year understanding fully the weight of what I lost, not just in you as my mate, but in the partnership that made me capable of leading this pack effectively. I do not ask for anything from you now, beyond what you have already generously offered through your guidance to the Council. I simply wanted you to know that I understand, finally and completely, exactly what I threw away." Elena nodded slowly, accepting his words without offering the kind of comfort or reassurance that might have suggested any path back toward what they had once shared. "I hope you continue to lead Blackthorn well," she said. "The pack deserves stability and genuine care from its leader, and I believe you have the capacity to provide that, even if it took difficult circumstances to teach you its true cost." She turned and walked away then, back toward the group of alphas and advisors who awaited her continued input on matters of regional cooperation, leaving Damien standing alone in the courtyard with the full weight of understanding finally settling over him with complete and undeniable clarity. He watched her move through the gathered crowd with the easy confidence of a woman who had built an entirely new life from the wreckage he had created, respected and valued for her own strength, rather than any bond that had once tied her to him. In that quiet moment, watching Elena address the assembled council with the authority and wisdom she had cultivated entirely on her own terms, Damien understood with a clarity that settled deep into his bones that he had not simply lost a mate through his own careless choices. He had lost the finest partner and leader he would likely ever know, a woman who had transformed the pain of profound betrayal into the foundation for a life more powerful and more respected than anything she had held while standing beside him as his queen. Whatever years remained ahead of him as Alpha King of Blackthorn, he understood now that he would carry this loss with him always, a permanent reminder of the moment he had chosen a fleeting comfort over the steady, unbreakable partnership that had made him whole. He had lost his queen forever, and no title, no apology, and no passage of time would ever fully restore what his own divided heart had cost him.